So I ended my last video by insisting that, despite what Michael Lewis wrote in Moneyball, the real legacy of advanced stats was not how they kept small market teams competitive with big market teams. It was, in fact, traditional stars like Cy Young winner Barry Zito and MVP Miguel Tejada who made the Athletics so good in the early 2000s, not any sabermetric darlings. And when those traditional stars left, Oakland stopped being competitive. But Moneyball did obviously capture something important. As I've talked about already in this series, there were cultural changes in front offices as they got bigger and younger and more highly educated, and related to that, there was the adoption of advanced stats to find hidden value in players. So if these changes weren't really about competitive balance, about helping the lowly Athletics compete with the mighty Yankees, then what were they about? Well, to understand that, we have to remember that when people in baseball complain about competitive balance, they are really complaining about free agency. See, as I suggested in my intro video, you can't understand the legacy of Moneyball without looking at baseball free agency, which was finally exploding in the years prior to the book. Free agency in baseball began in 1976, but for almost 2 full decades, it was really marred by illegal collusion among the owners and then labor troubles when the league tried to impose a salary cap on the union, which of course led to the strike in 1994. It was only after that failed that salary growth really took off, and in the years that followed, you saw a slew of contracts that seemed to completely change the scale of what baseball players were paid. In 1990, Jose Canseco signed the first contract worth over $20 million. In 1996, Albert Bell passed $50 million, then Kevin Brown got over $100 million in 1998, and in 2000, Alex Rodriguez signed a deal worth over $250 million. By now, fans have mostly gotten used to numbers this big. I mean, Shohei Ohtani signed a $700 million deal last offseason, although almost all of that was deferred. But in the 90s, when the numbers were going up so fast, from 20 to 250 in just 10 years, it was really jarring to see what these players were making. And every time one of these contracts were signed, you'd see people freaking out over how terrible it was for the game.
Just over 2 years ago, Albert Bell became the game's first $50 million player. There was an uproar then, but the money keeps flowing. Former A's GM Sandy Alderson, who's now working in the commissioner's office, called Brown's deal an affront to baseball. Well, Padres owner John Moore is paid $80 million to become the club's majority owner in 1994, and he isn't happy with the new economic picture. He said, "It's truly a tragic day for baseball. It confirms my worst fears about what would happen if we let Murdoch buy the Dodgers. I think the system is at the point of absolutely breaking down. We're on the verge of destroying the competitiveness of many, many ball clubs. Maybe this will be the straw that broke the camel's back."
All this bitching and moaning mostly came from owners who did not want to share baseball's revenues with players, and indeed had spent decades, really more like a century, fighting against any changes that might lead to players getting paid more. This is what owners always do in every industry when workers start gaining some power. They fight back and demonize those workers. But if you're an owner, you can't just say players shouldn't get paid more because you want to be the only rich guy and you don't want to share. You have to pretend it's bad for baseball for players to get paid. One guy doing this was, as you heard in that clip, Sandy Alderson. By the late 1990s, Alderson was working in the commissioner's office, but before that he'd been Oakland's general manager, where he'd hired Billy Beane and started the whole trend towards sabermetrics in the Oakland front office. And in Alderson, you can see a direct connection between Moneyball and the backlash to free agency. Indeed, the trends Moneyball highlights are trends that were put in place by people like Alderson, whose job was to protect owners against the players' rising salaries and growing power. Even before the book came out, Alderson was yelling from the rooftops every time a new contract was announced, basically shouting his own version of the argument Michael Lewis would make in the book. These contracts were terrible for the game because they destroyed competitive balance. After all, how could little old Oakland compete with the big bad New York Yankees for free agents? Now, it's important to say this very clearly. This was not true. Free agency increases competitive balance because it allows bad teams to quickly improve by signing better players. Since free agency has really opened up, baseball has had way more competitive balance than it had in previous eras. We have not had a repeat World Series winner since the late 1990s, and every Major League Baseball team has made the postseason at least once in the last decade. Low payroll teams like the 2015 Royals, the 2003 Marlins, and the 2017 Astros have managed to win the World Series, and the idea that a team needs to be in a so-called big market to spend money is belied by the fact that teams in Detroit, San Diego, and St. Louis have all had stretches where they spent a lot of money. There are many complicated reasons for all these facts, some of which I'll get to as I go through this series. But the important point for now is that the whole sky is falling narrative that Moneyball and Sandy Alderson indulged in back in the early 2000s was a total lie. There was no great competitive balance crisis precipitated by free agency. That was just a myth perpetuated by these same owners who had always hated free agency because it meant they had to pay players more. They hated it in the 1980s when they illegally colluded. They hated it in the 90s when they tried to impose a salary cap. And they hated it in the 2000s when Moneyball came out. Indeed, a big chunk of Moneyball is specifically framed around 3 free agents who left the Oakland Athletics prior to the 2002 season. Jason Isringhausen, who signed a 4-year, $27 million deal with the Cardinals. Johnny Damon, who signed with Boston for 4 years and $31 million, and Jason Giambi, who went to the Yankees for 7 years and $120 million. Billy Beane's brilliance and the sabermetric revolution are seen as necessary if Oakland is going to compete after losing players who altogether were worth nearly $200 million. And in the book, Michael Lewis plants the seeds of 2 new myths that gradually came to define the backlash to free agency as the dire warnings about competitive balance issued by people like Sandy Alderson and Kevin Towers never came to fruition. The first new anti-free agency argument that Moneyball advances is that signing free agents is actually stupid. For one, closers like Isringhausen are systematically overvalued, so it doesn't make sense to sign closers. As for Johnny Damon, well, don't even get these guys started on Johnny Damon.
The Boston Red Sox see Johnny Damon and they see a star who's worth $7.5 million a year. When I see Johnny Damon, what I see is an imperfect understanding of where runs come from. The guy's got a great glove. He's a decent leadoff hitter. He can steal bases, but is he worth the $7.5 million a year that the Boston Red Sox are paying him? No. Baseball thinking is medieval.
In other words, even if Isringhausen and Damon both won World Series titles for the teams that signed them, it was actually stupid for teams to try to sign players like that because they weren't really worth it. It was hard to say that so much about Jason Giambi, who really had been the centerpiece of Oakland's offense. So instead, for that one, Michael Lewis went to the second myth, which is that a star's production can be replicated by finding marginal upgrades throughout the lineup. As Brad Pitt says in the movie,
"Guys, you're still trying to replace Giambi. I told you we can't do it, and we can't do it. Now, what we might be able to do is recreate him. Recreate him in the aggregate.
Recreate him in the aggregate. In other words, rather than sign stars, what the A's are going to do is find undervalued hitters like Scott Hatteberg and David Justice who add up to Jason Giambi. These 2 points, first, that most free agents aren't worth it, and second, that the ones who are can be recreated in the aggregate through smart investments in cheaper players, helped to define the backlash to free agency for years after Moneyball came out. Indeed, as the Yankees dynasty crumbled and teams like the Angels, Marlins, and White Sox made World Series runs, the narrative around free agency changed. Now it wasn't that teams needed to sign expensive free agents to win. Now it was that signing expensive free agents was actually bad for you. People pointed to the disappointing production of surly superstars like Kevin Brown and Albert Bell. Alex Rodriguez's record-setting contract was blamed for setting back the Texas Rangers. Even the Yankees' failure to win a World Series after giving Giambi a massive contract seemed to validate this anti-free agency feeling. Instead, the proper way to build your team was the Moneyball way, by avoiding big contracts and creating stars in the aggregate. Even now, all these years later, many fans and writers rush to call every major contract an overpay. Keith Law, one of the early sabermetric acolytes, who I actually like and is a smart guy, but he's famous for this. No contract is ever worth it, according to Keith Law. And yet, it's important to say that the basic premise of Moneyball was incorrect. They did not actually recreate Jason Giambi in the aggregate. The A's offense scored 84 fewer runs than it had the year before, dropping from the 5th best offense in baseball to the 9th. It was only because their pitching was just as good, plus a little luck in one-run games, that they managed to still win 103 games in 2002. Because it turns out good players are actually good for your team, and signing free agents is a good way to add good players. Now, a little bit goes a long way. As I said, baseball has not actually been dominated by big market teams since free agency began, but it does help. Free agency is not actually some major problem for the game, either because it is causing a competitive balance crisis that never happened, or that high-paid superstars like Shohei Ohtani and Aaron Judge are secretly bad for your team for some reason. But free agency was bad for owners who previously were able to suppress players' salaries and now actually have to share the revenues generated by the game. Moneyball was a good story, and because of that, it got fans to sympathize with people whose job is to help owners save money. But it would be a big mistake to let them define what is good for baseball as a whole.